It's it's a really strange thing to hold two completely contradictory images in your mind at the exact same time.
Oh, absolutely. It causes this sort of cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah, exactly. So picture this for a second. On one hand, you have this incredibly heart-wrenching, intimate scene of a terrified preschooler
Mhm.
shivering in a floppy-eared aqua blue rabbit hat, just a tiny, vulnerable kid.
Right. And then hold that image right next to a sweeping cinematic vision of metallic grandeur.
Like what?
Well, like F-22 Raptors tearing through the sky over the Middle East, and ancient Spartan warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with bronze shields in the blistering sun.
Wow. Yeah, it really feels like you're looking at two entirely different universes, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, one is so vulnerable, so painfully micro, and the other is this massive historical display of civilization and warfare. You almost get whiplash trying to reconcile how both of those realities exist in the same world.
But they do exist in our world. And figuring out how a society reconciles those two extremes is our exact mission for this deep dive.
Yes, it is. We've got some fascinating material to get through today.
We do. We are looking at a stack of sources centered around two starkly different political poems. They were both published in March of 2026 by the award-winning author and academic, Dr. J.P. Lindstroth.
Right, and to give you the listener some context, we have Little Blue Rabbit, which
Yeah.
was published in Dissident Voice, and then we have this epic piece called Imperatori Pars of Agarb, or The Persian Empire in the West, published in the New Verse News.
Which means we are diving headfirst into the third rails of modern society. I mean, these poems tackle U.S. immigration policy, the geopolitical powder keg between the U.S. and Iran, and the deep partisan divisions tearing at the fabric of America.
It's heavy stuff, really heavy stuff.
It is. So, because these pieces touch on such highly charged, sensitive material, I want to be crystal clear with you right up front. Neither of us are taking sides today.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint found in these texts, whether they lean left or lean right.
Right. Instead, we are basically putting on our anthropologist hats alongside the author. We are here strictly as your impartial guides to unpack the ideas, the historical context, and, well, the raw emotions these sources capture about our modern world.
That's really the best way to approach it.
Hmm?
We're treating these poems as artifacts. We want to see what they reveal about the society that produced them.
Okay, so let's start by looking through the micro lens. Little Blue Rabbit deals with the human cost of border policies. And it opens with a hyper-specific, almost jarring visual.
It really does. It paints such a vivid picture.
Yeah, we have this tiny boy with a gap-toothed smile, cherubic cheeks, and what the poet calls puppy Nigrin opal eyes.
And for anyone unfamiliar with that term, Nigrin just means black or dark. So it's that deep, sorrowful, wide-eyed look of a frightened puppy.
That's such a striking image. And he's wearing that aqua floppy-eared rabbit hat, a checkered black and white jacket, and a Spider-Man backpack.
You know, the Spider-Man backpack does so much heavy lifting in that stanza.
How
Well, it is a universal symbol of childhood normalcy. I mean, every parent, every person who's been to a kindergarten classroom recognizes that backpack.
Oh, for sure.
But the poem instantly shatters that normalcy by placing the child into an enormous black ICE SUV that's splashed with snow and road salts.
And the physical setting is just as jarring as the emotional one. I mean, the text notes, he is moving from the bitter cold of Minnesota to the Texas desert, heading to a detention facility.
Yeah, the geographical leap highlights the disorientation he must be feeling.
Exactly. And there's this heartbreaking detail where the child's family lawyer shows these simple crayon drawings, scribbles of his parents and siblings, but they are surrounded by crude swirling razor wire.
Right, and they're crying and frowning stick figures. And the whole time, this little boy is looking upward, frightened, asking about his mama.
The perspective is entirely from the floor looking up, isn't it?
It is. The boy is surrounded by federal agents, but to him, they're mostly just legs. Lindstroth actually writes that the agents are like giant sequoia trees in a forest of adults.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I kind of want to challenge that metaphor.
Go for it.
Comparing federal agents to giant sequoia trees, isn't that just standard poetic hyperbole? Why is that considered an actual indictment of policy rather than just a kid being scared of tall adults? I mean, any 5-year-old thinks adults look like trees.
That's a really good point. But it's the nature of a sequoia tree that makes the metaphor so devastating.
What do you mean?
Well, a tree isn't just tall. It's unfeeling. It's immovable. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't bend. And it certainly doesn't care if you're crying at its roots.
Oh, wow. I didn't think about it like that.
Yeah, so by describing the agents as a forest of sequoias, Lindstroth is capturing exactly how monolithic and immovable government bureaucracy feels to the vulnerable people caught inside it.
Right, the system isn't made of people making moral choices anymore.
Exactly. It has become a blind force of nature.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't reason with a forest.
You really can't. And the author doesn't just leave us in that emotional state either. He rapidly shifts the camera lens, pulling back to deliver a harsh indictment of systemic failures.
Yeah, he drops these massive political questions right into the middle of this sad scene, asking point blank, who is to blame for this?
He runs down a whole checklist of geopolitical complexities. He asks, is it NAFTA? Is it Trump? Is it the history of civil wars in Central America? Or is it 40 years of sheer ineptitude in immigration reform?
So he's forcing the reader to grapple with the massive causal chain that somehow ended with a preschooler in an icy SUV.
Exactly. And to drive that point home, the source material notes he references a famous 1937 painting by Siqueiros called Echo of a Scream.
Which is an incredibly intentional choice, right?
Oh, absolutely. That painting depicts the horrors of the Spanish Civil War through the image of a crying infant surrounded by industrial destruction. Lindstroth uses it here to represent the crying shrieks of innocence everywhere.
But the real tragedy of the poem is that the little boy isn't screaming, he's just shocked into silence.
Right. It's chilling.
You know, this brings up a really important question about how we consume information.
How do you mean?
Well, if you read a news headline that says, border apprehensions up by 15%, your brain immediately goes into a defensive partisan posture. You start arguing about policy.
Oh, completely. Becomes a debate.
Right, but poetry operates differently. It bypasses our political defensive shields through narrative empathy. You can't easily argue with a terrified kid in a Spider-Man backpack.
You're touching on the exact mechanism of why poetry is an anthropological tool.
Okay.
It grounds abstract data into visceral human reality.
The tragedy here is how incredibly small that boy is against the giant machinery of the state.
Yes.
But what's fascinating is that just 5 days later, Lindstroth zooms out from that single icy East SUV to look at the entire machinery of Western civilization itself.
It's a massive pivot.
It really is. We move to our second source, the epic war poem dedicated to our armed forces called Emperatory Pars Begarb, or the Persian Empire and the West.
The scale of this piece is staggering. I mean, it opens with blindingly vivid imagery of the ancient world. Armies of men kicking up dust. Athenian owls and Spartan lambda letters painted on rounded shields.
Corinthian helmets with horsehair plumes.
Exactly. Lindstroth describes their muscular cuirasses shining orient and golden in harsh sunlight.
Orient, meaning shining with gold, which instantly elevates these ancient warriors to an almost mythic, godlike status.
He's setting up the ancient existential threat of the Persian Empire under Darius the Great and Xerxes against the Greek Isles. The poem references legends like Miltiades at the Battle of Marathon and King Leonidas at Thermopylae.
So the foundational argument here is that the Greeks, despite all their internal city-state rivalries, stood as a unified wall against a massive authoritarian empire.
Right, and if they hadn't held that line, Western civilization and the very concept of democracy might never have existed.
But he doesn't leave us in the ancient world, does he? He hits the fast-forward button, jumping more than 2.5 millennia into the future to a modern conflict with Old Persia.
Yeah, the text traces the evolution of that region into a modern Shia Islamic state. It touches on the Shah, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the American hostage crisis, and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini.
So the bronze swords are suddenly gone. Now we are dealing with artificial intelligence, aircraft carriers, and missiles.
It's a huge technological leap.
Yeah, the poem describes American jets, Raptors, and Harriers ripping azure skies, sending missiles across the Strait of Hormuz to fight the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
It's a very intense modern combat scene.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. When I was reading this section, I felt a massive inherent contradiction in the text.
Break that down. Where is the friction?
Well, the poem is clearly reverent toward military sacrifice. It honors the medals of honor, the white crosses of Normandy, and the red poppy fields of the Somme.
Right, it explicitly talks about the weightiness of death.
Exactly. But in the very same breath, it aggressively mourns these young men who are clashing in arms for what the poet calls generals' musings far removed. So how can a piece glorify the visceral machinery of war and the might of these F-22 Raptors while simultaneously condemning the detached leaders who turn that machinery on?
I'd actually argue that contradiction is the entire engine of the poem.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Lindstrath is relying heavily on the concept of cyclical history. He explicitly writes, "And so our past repeats, again and again."
Okay, so how does that explain the generals?
To understand his point about the generals, we have to look at the historical parallel he draws with the Peloponnesian War.
That's the conflict where Athens and Sparta turn on each other, right?
Yes, and the timing is crucial. They had just united to achieve this impossible, glorious victory over Persia. They saved their civilization.
Right, the Golden Age.
Exactly. And then, almost immediately in historical terms, their ideological differences plunged them into a devastating, decades-long civil war, brother against brother.
Wow.
They battered themselves so thoroughly that it ultimately led to the collapse of their Golden Age. Lindstrath connects that directly to our modern American situation. He calls it how civil wars intertwine.
Ah, I see. The text asks the reader, can you not see we are the same brethren, those of the reds, whites, and blues?
He's mapping ancient Greek infighting perfectly onto modern American partisan polarization.
It makes me think of an autoimmune disease.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, you can have this incredibly robust external armor, a massive high-tech immune system designed to fight off external threats like a modern geopolitical rival or an authoritarian regime.
Right.
But if the body gets confused and starts attacking its own healthy cells...
All that external armor is completely useless.
Exactly. The F-22 Raptors can't save you if the disease is inside the house.
That is a perfect analogy for what the text is warning about. It's a dual threat.
How so?
Well, the poem acknowledges the external authoritarian danger. It identifies the oppressive Iranian theocracy supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But it argues that the much more fatal disease is internal collapse brought on by our own division.
So we are our own worst enemy.
Pretty much. He even brings in the biblical story of the House of David and the revenge of Absalom to highlight the ultimate tragedy of familial discord.
So the missiles over the Strait of Hormuz are just the symptoms. The actual disease is us fighting ourselves. The poem says we need to reverse time and save our democratia.
Yes.
And democracy isn't just the modern act of casting a ballot, is it?
Far from it. Democracy in the classical sense meant the actual power and capacity of the people to govern themselves.
Which takes a lot more than just voting.
Right. It requires a shared reality and a shared commitment to the survival of the state above individual factions.
Which brings us to a critical pivot. We have these two vastly different pieces of writing. The micro-tragedy of the ICE SUV and the macro-historical epic of Western civilization.
Right.
To understand how they actually connect, we have to look at the person holding the pen. Dr. J.P. Lindstrath isn't just a poet writing from an armchair.
He really isn't. He holds a PhD in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford.
That's no small feat.
Not at all. He's an adjunct professor at Palm Beach State College, a former Fulbright scholar to Brazil, and the author of dense, award-winning academic books like Epical Reckonings and Politics and Racism Beyond Nations.
So this is a person who has spent his entire professional life studying human systems, cultural conflict, and how societies function or fail to function.
And you see that anthropological training completely take over the final stanza of the Persian Empire poem.
Yeah, the tone shifts dramatically.
It does. After thousands of words about Spartan shields and modern fighter jets, he suddenly pivots the camera right back to domestic American soil. He warns that we are dealing with mendacity and profiteering at the expense of our community.
The language he uses to describe modern America is razor sharp. He calls out hypercapitalism for undermining social welfare and criticizes a neo-Gilded Age entitlement.
He points the finger directly at leaders who are immune from sneering, who direct the public toward foreign wars while avoiding any personal accountability or investigations.
Meanwhile, everyday citizens bear the tariffed expense.
Exactly. It's a searing diagnosis of what the poem terms extreme corruption.
He practically begs the reader to remember the thinkers of the Enlightenment. He lists Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau.
Because those are the architects of the social contract. Locke argued that government only exists through the consent of the governed to protect basic rights.
Right.
And Montesquieu gave us the separation of powers specifically to prevent the extreme corruptium Lindstrath is warning about. When those principles fail, the autoimmune disease takes over.
So how does the Oxford anthropologist connect the epic geopolitical war with the little boy freezing in the Texas desert?
There is one specific unmissable line in the final stanza of the Persian Empire poem.
Yeah, right amidst his plea to uphold the pillars of our democratic oaths, Linsroth explicitly tells Americans not to scapegoat the newest from migration.
It's the linchpin of his entire argument.
It loops perfectly back to the little blue rabbit,
History.
giant sequoias, the
Huh?
razor wire, the Spider-Man backpack. The author is demanding that we recognize a fundamental truth. You cannot celebrate the defense of freedom, you cannot honor the white crosses of Arlington, or the legacy of the Spartans if you are simultaneously crushing the vulnerable at your own borders.
Because tyranny isn't just a foreign army. Tyranny is also a bureaucratic machine that treats a terrified preschooler as a logistical problem rather than a human being.
Wow, that's powerful.
Linstroth is demanding consistency in our moral center. A society that fights oppression abroad but exercises cruelty at home has already broken its social contract.
It really shifts your perspective. True strength isn't just possessing the most advanced AI or the fastest jets. True strength is unity, and you cannot have unity without empathy.
Exactly.
You can't be the political miscreant he mentions in the text, living a privileged life while actively pitting citizens against one another.
It demands that we ask ourselves, are we upholding our end of the Enlightenment ideals? Are we protecting our democratia? Or are we letting extreme corruption and partisan bickering rot us from the inside out, just like Athens and Sparta?
You know, for anyone listening right now, you might be wondering why we are spending time dissecting poetry.
It's a valid question.
Yeah, we live in an age of push notifications, 247 geopolitical analysis, and endless data streams. When a crisis happens at the border or a missile strikes in the Middle East, your phone tells you instantly. Why read a poem about it?
Because data only tells you what happened today. It gives you the statistics, the troop movements, the border apprehension numbers, but numbers don't have a conscience.
Exactly. When you hear a statistic about migration, it's easy to swipe it away. But when you read about a gap-toothed kid in a floppy rabbit hat crying for his mom while federal agents tower over him like sequoias, it forces you to stop.
It anchors that massive geopolitical shift to real human empathy.
And when you read about tensions with Iran, poetry connects that push notification to the deep, cyclical history of human civilization. It reminds us that we have been here before, and we have made these mistakes before.
Poetry serves as a permanent emotional record of a society's deepest anxieties. It's a time capsule.
So here is a thought I want to leave you with to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Think about the anthropologists of the distant future.
Hundreds, maybe thousands of years from now.
Right. Eventually, they are going to dig up the digital archives of the poetry we are writing today.
Poems about AI, F-22 Raptors, and ICE SUVs.
When they read those texts, what will they think of us? Will they look at our art and see a civilization that managed to cure its autoimmune disease, a society that remembered its humanity and upheld its Enlightenment ideals?
Or will they see a civilization that possessed the most incredible metallic grandeur in human history, but still lost its way in a forest of giant sequoias?
Right. Succumbing to the exact internal divisions its poets so desperately warned against. So the next time you look at a push notification about a border crisis or a missile strike, ask yourself, are you just looking at the data, or are you looking at the history we are destined to repeat? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.